She's best known for reporting from war-torn regions all over the world for the BBC, work that's seen her awarded Reporter of the Year twice for the UK's Royal Television Society.
We are, of course, speaking of Kate Adie, who is also a successful author, having released Fighting on the Home Front, The Legacy of Women in World War I just this last year.
Well, I caught up with her a little bit earlier at the festival, and I began by asking what first sparked her interest in the First World War.
Most wars are by their traditional nature about what men do, and because of the convention that men do the fighting and that men make the decision to go to war. If you actually look at today's wars, part of that is still true, and there's still this sort of sense that wars are all about what men do. But you look at the pictures in places like Syria and in Egypt and now in Ukraine, there are crowds full of women, young women in particular, because war and violence and everything have been now spring out of often desires for democracy and change, which is how the First World War started with Gavrilo Princip. And now we have much better educated people, and women are part of it. And I always felt that very strongly when I was a reporter. It wasn't just about men and guns, it was about everybody.
For these women, though, the ones that you're really capturing, what was life like for them, the war on the home front?
Hugely hard. It was over 4 years of war, intense. The worst thing for all of them was the just huge number of casualties. Husbands and fathers and brothers and fiancés just didn't come back, or came back terribly injured. And that was, for most families, the worst thing. Every family was touched by it in some way, knew somebody who was a casualty of the war. And war was also hard because if they went to work, they worked 12 hours a day in factories and in other jobs. They were still only paid half what men were. So life was tough in every way for them.
You've reported from some fairly hard places, some fairly difficult situations. You've spoken previously of the difficulties of travelling somewhere and wanting to feed a crowd of starving people, but knowing that if you only feed 2 of them, that you'll start a riot. How do you approach situations
Well,
like
it's
that?
reporting like any other. I mean, I think that the basics of reporting are that, first of all, you're privileged to go somewhere odd, different, new. Heavens above, you never know where you're going to go. So that's a treat. It can be a bit tough, but it's still a treat. The second thing is you go when something is happening. That's why you're there, for the news. It's interesting, intriguing, and often very significant. And the things you're looking for is to describe it all to people at home, to give a bit of background as well. If you're working in television, you have the pictures. You want to complement that with listening to what people tell you off screen, finding things out, trying to find out what the reason for all of this is, and to try and tell it honestly and straightforwardly.
And you've certainly been able to take part in a lot of these fascinating events, meet a lot of these fascinating people. Last time we spoke a couple of years ago, you told me that Colonel Gaddafi was certainly one of the more standout interviews of your career that shaped you. But what about in the past year? What's been a major story for you?
I think it's 2 continuing stories, and they both sort of affect huge numbers of countries across the world. And that the first one is both a sort of good and a not so good story. The not so good, I think, is the rise of the gap between rich and poor. Rich people are getting much, much, much richer. They fly about in helicopters. They go and have a wonderful life. Some of them have really earned their riches. A great number of them have not. And the gap between them and those who have nothing, or those who have very little, is widening enormously. And I don't think it's a healthy thing for the world, unless there is some understanding that some of that wealth should be spread about. And that leads me to the second one, which I think is really good news, and though it may be painful, there is a much greater push now towards freedom of speech, democracy, for the self-expression of people all over. You can see it in so many places where young people are learning because of the wonders of communication and saying, that looks interesting, that's intriguing, I want to know more about that. Maybe I want to travel, I want to see something differently, I want things run differently, I want my life to be different.